Thank you, panelists, for your views. We have some questions that were put forward before we began tonight, and we'll go over a few of those, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A to the audience. Now that we have that background and additional context, I'd like to start with where we are in the process. There was a city's technical review committee this afternoon, so what happened there and what can we expect going forward? Anyone can.
I'll start, and then I know everybody's got different thoughts about this. So there was a review at the technical review committee at the city today at the Gilliard. We were anxiously awaiting that. It was the second review from the city. And I guess it was unsurprising, but still nonetheless frustrating, the response that we got from the city. They actually dropped a lot of comments that we were encouraged by back in early March. They ended up dropping them because I guess they got pushback. Frankly, the developer didn't really incorporate a lot of the comments that were shared. There was no discussion whatsoever about affordable housing. That's still just a big kind of question mark that we don't know about, which of course feeds into this notion of what kind of community values does this project really encapsulate. So suffice it to say, there's a lot of questions still left on the table, and we're left wanting more. There was a lot that was shared, and it was shared very quickly, and a lot of it was kind of hard to decipher, frankly. So the comments have yet to be posted, at least before I was able to come to this event. So we look forward to reading those comments.
And I'll add, in terms of the open space, the city raised the same issues that we've raised about counting property behind the critical line and what counts as open space. And so they have asked the developer to come forward with a plan that details the acreage of each of those categories. So we are at least encouraged to see that they are following up on that to make sure they're meeting at least the minimum requirement. Of course, this is public land. We should do more than the bare minimum. We should have civic values represented, civic uses incorporated into the site. But at least we are starting to see that question asked. But as most of us looked at our phones this evening, we find that, well, perhaps they're going to ignore those comments. We don't know yet. We'll see what happens when this gets to the Planning Commission. But it is important that we keep up the drumbeat. They did at least say that we were not going to have the green space be last. We've encouraged them to have a schedule so that the parks are built not at the end of the process, but in schedule with the rest of the development. And so we are pleased to see that piece come forward.
I would just add that as far as next steps, the ball is clearly in the port's court. They don't need an approval from the TRC to move forward. We sense that they want to get this in front of City Council as soon as possible and understand that they have a timeline. But anybody who watched that meeting from the port side should have heard that this plan as proposed has serious concerns associated with it, and that they would be wise to take the time and go back to the drawing board.
Thank you all. A question for Faith, and you went into great detail in your presentation, and you just mentioned a minute ago about civic values and uses, which are kind of elusive, but do you have thoughts about what those values and uses might be, and how would they be incorporated in Brian said that one of your quips was put it in the PUD, so how might those be included?
Well, I think it's important to note that if we don't articulate those values and put them in writing, people have a tendency to forget what they committed to on the front end. And so we have no guarantees that the artistic renderings will show up when the buildings are made. And as Winslow just showed us, we have much to fear, that people will forget commitments to values. But we are in this space right next to the place that our city has dedicated to commemorating the slave trade. You know, I had the opportunity to travel to Ghana when I worked in the Congress, And I saw the other side of the ocean that my ancestors left. And I always liked running on the beach, and I came back to Sullivan's and went running on the beach. So I ran in both places. And I think it is important to recognize the vast temerity it took to survive and leave those shores in Ghana and get off of that boat in Charleston, Sullivan's, and then in Charleston, and keep your life moving forward. The space we have for the African American Museum is centered on that place, right? On the idea that whether we came through Ellis Island or through the Port of Charleston, we left an experience behind and we have an opportunity to make our place in America. Going through that museum will be a challenge, but if we're going to commemorate the history, let's not just have people commemorate centuries of history and pain and sacrifice and strength and victory, and then go to the coffee shop. Why not leave some space to think about what just transpired there? So look at that rice mill and think not only about the sacrifice of the slaves who produced that rice, but also the ingenuity of the entrepreneurs who worked at that site to get rice out to the rest of the world. That's a part of what made Charleston, Charleston. And so from my vantage point, I think people are going to need some breathing space between those two sites. And if a civic value has already been established that we will commemorate in this space, let's leave people with at least enough air to breathe and sunshine and wind for that civic value to be honored.
That was speaking of writing things down, I think you just gave an excellent and very eloquent description of the value of resilience and the human spirit. So thank you.
Thank you.
Brian, your presentation showed the context of the site with surrounding neighborhoods, including Ansonboro. Why wouldn't they, the Low and the ports, support that, which seems like a obvious thing to do, is to connect with this long-established historical neighborhood and match its character?
Yeah, I think that as we all sink our heads into this process, Union Pier gives us the opportunity, I think, to hit on a lot of different values, things we've done right in Charleston, but things we've done wrong, too. One of the first things I noticed moving here is that we have fewer civic green spaces than comparable communities like Savannah, nearby, and big public cities, and that's one thing that Charleston could use more of. And so in some ways, I think it's right for the team to think about having a new neighborhood that has amenities that don't just replicate the past. At the same time, we have a lot of uninspiring new construction. When Winslow showed that picture of the building at the foot of the bridge, I get more questions about how did that happen than anything else. And for anybody looking to do a master planning process in such a sensitive site context, I mean, you have to be aware that this trend is on people's minds. I mean, this, and I would assume that all of our city council members are hearing it too, if we're hearing it. And so you need to go above and beyond. I mean, we're talking about an opportunity like no other in Charleston's history. I mean, Ann said that we've never really seen a land use change of this magnitude. So let's think on a grand scale. And it's thinking about the site in a way that provides for variation. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to just be an extension of Ansonboro, but it can be things that we don't have, but it can be a mixture of uses as well. It can contribute to a varied skyline. But what we see in front of us, I think is, an uninspiring land use plan with sort of row after row of building with maximum flexibility built in. I think it's a sort of a Hail Mary attempt to get something through, and I'm really glad Charleston so far seems to have been pushing back pretty hard on it.
I might just add something, Vince, on that front in terms of why hasn't, Ansonboro been seen as the kind of the metric that they would at least build off of, right? Any good developer looks at its surroundings, at the surroundings of their site and build off of that. And I think it's pretty clear, and frankly, I mean, the port has not been shy about this issue, which is what is the motivation for the development, and that is to maximize return to invest in Hugh Leatherman. I mean, Barbara's been very explicit about that. And
Barbara Melvin.
Barbara Melvin, the head of the port, thank you. And so when you lead a project with that sort of mandate and that sort of statement, that's your value statement, then, you know, it's a real problem. Because what we're seeing then is that we are getting a plan like what we have here that maximizes return to the detriment of the community around it. And so, you know, what we'd like to see is flipping that script, not going to a financially driven model that's going to detract from this incredible city, but to go in it with a sort of values-driven model. And values can be all kinds of different things. It can be resiliency, it can be open space, access to the water, it can be, you know, workforce and attainable housing. There's lots of, you know, incredible urban design. There's lots of values that we could lead with. And so I think what we would like to, our sort of mantra and our talking points, particularly as we get into Planning Commission and then moving forward from there to Council, is to push the City Council, because they do have the authority to hit the pause button on this project. It's been moving too quickly, and they can plan and have a city-led, values-driven plan that involves the community and plan for all those things that we've talked about, because there's this huge donut hole of planning here, which is very unfortunate for a site of this size and its location. There's such opportunity, and they can do that. They've got a year. And so that's ample opportunity through various planning efforts that are already underway, like the Comprehensive Water Plan, the Peninsula Plan, which is the update to the downtown plan. Sorry, lots of plans. But these efforts are underway. So we're not saying, oh, we're just going to obstruct and delay this thing ad nauseum. I mean, these efforts are underway. And so we can plug into those. We've got world-class experts looking at all these things for downtown, and we need to plug into that.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you, Winslow, and ask, how would you respond when someone says the development and infrastructure costs dictate the need for height, scale, and density?
Yeah, I mean, that's a standard argument that certainly has been put out there throughout this process, which is the infrastructure is going to be very expensive. So taking away, oh, the port needs to make a bundle, to say the infrastructure is expensive, so therefore you have to have this level of density in order to pay for that infrastructure. To me, that's somewhat of a false narrative. Of course, there's a connection, there's a correlation between infrastructure and value. And, you know, and I don't want to get into TIFs and tax increment financing districts and how all that works, but I think it's a false narrative in that obviously the density drives the level of infrastructure that you need. So the more dense it is, the more infrastructure you need, the more expensive it's going to be. I mean, there's no question this is going to be an expensive site to develop. I mean, like I said, I mean, half of it is out over the water on piers. And so they're going to have to take all that stuff away, so the demo costs and, you know, the piling that you can imagine, lifting it up to get it out of the storm surge. I mean, the environmental issues, which of course we know nothing about in terms of what's underneath that brick or that concrete pancake, as Thomas Waltz calls it. You know, there's a lot of questions out there. But I think to, again, lead by saying, hey, this is going to be super expensive to build, therefore we have to have this density that we're handing to you, is something we have to challenge. I mean, I just don't, there's this direct correlation, and that basically if we don't accept what they're giving, then we're not going to get all this incredible infrastructure. I'm not fully convinced that the infrastructure they proposed, obviously we'd love to see Concord Street extended. We'd love to see, you know, some of the other streets, Lawrence and Hazel, connected to the water. I mean, you know, all that is great. But to do that with that level of density that they're proposing, to me, that's not a fair trade. And I think we just need to ask the hard questions and be willing to challenge and push.
Sure.
The other thing we need to consider is that the infrastructure that they're talking about, a lot of that is a government responsibility. And there are federal government resources available for infrastructure. we can get that part done with the support of the federal government, with our federal tax dollars. We don't have to take all the density that they're proposing when we have other sources to support the government responsibility to get the flooding, the water out of Ansonboro.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, speaking of challenging and pushing, the property is, in theory anyway, belongs to all of us, the citizens of South Carolina. The State Ports Authority is an agent of the state. And then they've hired Lowe, who's an agent of the state Ports Authority, that's an agent of the state. The Ports Authority has frequently made the argument that they're an economic generator of the state, and they have a benefit that stretches all the way to the South Carolina upstate. Yet it seems like Charleston is on the hook to bear the cost for the statewide impact. And I'll ask you, Brian, to elaborate on this a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. I think that for us to be effective as advocacy organizations with this process, we need to first admit that the driver of the State Ports Authority is financial return. That is their focus. I would like to deliver the message that the value of goodwill towards the Charleston community is also sort of incalculable, and they want to maintain that. And I think that they are aware of that. But at the same time, to be effective, I think, in getting a plan that is more befitting of our community, I think we need to talk about what the gap is between something that's desirable and something that they feel like they can get their return on. And then identify sources and ways to fill that gap and show the port why the financially responsible decision here is not necessarily the direction that the Lowe team has led it. And that's why I think the power of having meaningful conversations about alternatives is warranted now. I think now's the time. I think now's the time because they've received the pushback, they've heard from the community. There's not a day I wake up and read the paper and it seems like somebody else has weighed in on this who I don't know of, but seems to share these concerns. And so I think that they need to take notice that there's a better way to do this, and that we, I think as very reasonable organizations, are willing to help handhold in that.
I would just add, to that point, this idea of the city of Charleston bearing the brunt of this because the port needs to use Union Pier as an ATM machine for Hugh Leatherman Terminal is, to say there are other ways, right? There's a huge infrastructure bill that's out there. There are resiliency funds out there. It's a federal issue. It's a state issue. To your point, the port is a huge economic driver for really not the low country as much as it is for the upstate. And so a lot of that money gets plowed into the upstate, which is fine. But, we really need to think about this as a statewide issue. And the governor and the legislature needs to get involved. And I know they've been investing a lot in the port with the deepening and Leatherman and other investments, but this is huge, and it really can't just fall on the backs of the city. And I think the other thing I would just challenge just quickly is this public financing piece, which is another huge donut hole in our understanding about this project. We have no idea how this is really going to work. They've yet to share any of the background information on the tax increment financing, who's participating, to your point, Faith. What the values are there. But, it's just, I think it's incumbent on our city leaders to really dig into that, because the city is going to be on the hook for this, and the taxpayers will be on the hook for this, and it's going to be a big figure. We've heard, at least under the current plan, $250 million just for infrastructure. It's a lot of money. We've got a lot of other needs in this community.
Sure. Final question for y'all. I know Ann, in her introductory comments, asked if there were any city council members in the audience I know there weren't at the time. Have any come in? Don't see any. I know I saw Clay Middleton, who's running for mayor. Are there any other mayoral candidates?
Thanks, Clay.
I think this is going to be a situation where the people have to lead and the leaders follow. And so in that light, I'll ask the panelists, what can people do to assist this effort?
Well, I'll start with the fact that, one, you're here. Coming out and becoming informed is essential to this effort. They are counting on all of us to just not pay attention and to go away on summer vacation, and by the time school starts, they'll be off to the races. I think it is our responsibility to be informed on the issues, express our views to the members of the Planning Commission and to City Council, and show up. We have to show up. We have a series of events that are coming up, which everybody will talk about, just to get everyone to the table. But understand that all three of our organizations have been at this for months and months and months. But when it gets to Planning Commission, when it gets to City Council, the developer will have 30, 45 minutes, an hour to make their case. We will each get 1 minute. 1 minute, 60 seconds to express the views of all of our membership. So we need the memberships to all show up and use your minutes.
That's right. I will build on that, Faith. A lot of times, I think people, they support our organizations and they think, well, they got it, you know. But we show up and it's sort of like we're treated like everybody else. And so showing up matters. And I think the Planning Commission is aware that this meeting on the 7th is going to be very important, presuming it goes forward. And we're going to need to be prepared. And I know it's hard for a lot of people too, you put yourself on the line when you speak up, but it does matter, and it builds that sense of community support for ideas, and I think it's our civic responsibility. We still do live in a democracy, and the land use entitlement process provides a lot of points of entry. So if it's not just the Planning Commission, it's, as was said earlier, it's just picking up the phone. You might think that everybody and their mother is calling Mike Seekings, but you can do it too, again. and they might not want to hear from you all the time, but we know we're making an impact when we're reaching their phones to a point of annoyance, because it's not, of course, us that have put them in this bind. It's an application that might have been pushed through without the benefit of a lot of good community thinking, and that's what we're asking for.
Thank you, Brian. Winslow?
Just to summarize, yeah, please, to the extent you can, write letters, call your council members. If you know some planning commissioners, do that too. Talk to your neighbors, particularly if you don't live on the peninsula and you live off peninsula in the city of Charleston. We need those council members to understand this is bigger than downtown. The peninsula of Charleston, it has impacts that ripple throughout this entire region and, of course, the state itself. So this matters and is relevant to so many different people, and we need to make that case. So be reaching out. Attend if you can. If you can't, there's lots of different ways to submit letters virtually, and you can physically write letters. But I do want to remind everyone that the next big date that we know of is June 7th, and that's going to be the first Planning Commission hearing. We're hoping they're not going to take a vote then, and it'll get pushed further into the summer with Planning Commission and then ultimately to Council. We'll keep everybody informed on those dates as we learn about them. That's part of it. We're trying to stay abreast of all this too, and it's not easy. And then also, we will be handing out those RAC cards as you walk out, and it has some sort of talking points, high-level bullets on one side, and then it has contact information on the other. So please do avail yourself of that information.
All right, great. Well, now we're going to switch over to audience questions, and we have a couple of microphones. Justin and Blair, y'all could raise your hands. Justin's at the top, Blair's here. I would ask if you do have a question, maybe come to the end of the row to ask it, so that'll make it easier. Feel welcome to frame your question in a comment, but please make it very short. I'd also remind you that we're having a reception immediately after this, so it'll provide more time to engage with one another and with our panelists. So with that, raise your hand if you have a question, please.
Yes, I wanted to talk about the open civic space. I wanted to see if it could be a sort of an amphitheater like they have in Atlanta, the Chastain Park, which is in a residential area. And I think it would be wonderful to have concerts in that area, or maybe like the Opera House that's in Australia, which is near the water. Something along those lines.
I guess I would start by saying, that's exactly what we've been talking about, that when you have a citizen-led, publicly led planning process, those are you solicit these kinds of ideas, and we've talked a lot about civic uses and the sort of lack of that in this plan. What does the city need? Do we need a school? Do we need a library? Do we need soccer fields? There's a whole wide spectrum of things, and do we need a fish market? Do we need a band shell or amphitheater? So those are great questions, and I agree. I think that idea of a civic use is we should be leading with that versus how much money can we make, and then we'll figure out what we can cram in.
Brian or Faith, I
was just going to add to that we're hearing a lot about, well, we're just at the master plan and we'll deal with other ideas when we're at a concept plan, but it's really, the master plan is going to determine built space versus open space, the central components. And so we lose the opportunity if we let a master plan go through that maximizes building footprint versus open space. And I think that point and other great ideas about civic use of open space and the way people approach a project through not just the built environment, but the space around it, it's a really important point, and that's exactly why we want to get that total up that Faith talked about.
Yeah, I'll just say that question reflects a level of aspiration toward excellence that I think we're together on this is kind of lacking, that we would like to see more of and that Charleston deserves. So thank you.
What's your opinion on, in addition to the council contacting members of the board of the port, as well as the governor, as well as the senators and representatives, because at the end of the day, they're at the top of the chain. And so it seems like we ought to hit it from both sides. In any warfare, you need to be asymmetric, I think.
Well said.
Yeah, 100%. I think our whole approach on this is like the more the better. People keep asking me, well, should I call this person? I'm like, yes and yes and yes. So if you know people on the port board, they need to be hearing from you. If you know the governor, he needs to be hearing from you. People in the legislature, the Charleston, the state delegation, Lindsey Graham, Tim Scott, talk to them all, please. Seriously, it's really important. And I think
Blair, I know there's some questions over here. Okay. All right.
Hey all, great presentation. Thanks for the comments, and love the GIS maps. My question is around the process. The meeting on the June 7th with the Planning Commission. Explain to me why the consortium, I call the three of you the consortium, would not also have ample time on the agenda for presentation. If it's just, and only just a developer, and then the public has the 1 minute increments. It just seems off a little, what's the rationale for that? Is there such?
And not only do we not get sort of equal or quarter time, they're going to hold the hearing at the pier. So that is how the process has worked. We've been limited. Sometimes you'll get up to 3 minutes to speak, but we've been limited in these information sessions to 1 minute.
I think the answer is custom. It's just been the custom of both city council as well as other commissions, and anybody who's been on a commission can maybe speak to it, but that nobody, and generally you can't cede your time to somebody else either. It's just the level of fairness, and that's how they do it.
Thank y'all. I have got so much information here, but my thing is housing. In that community, a whole black community was disfranchised to put a park in there. In the deal, it was supposed to be, when they built the condos and stuff in there, they were supposed to put a certain amount of housing for low income that was based on their income that they came in. I live in the one building that's there. And it has 41 units in it. We've got 73 acres of land there, and I feel like Charleston, the Port Authority, needs to put housing like that in there. They've got the thing, they got the museum, which is, I have visited, it is absolutely gorgeous. And I want the city of Charleston to give back the black community part of that, where people that was raised there can come back into the city and be again a part of the city, because they were moved completely out. And this was back in the 1996, late 1990s. So I feel like that somewhere there's got to be somebody that can, I really want, Mr. Clay, I want the black community to come and say, you need to give us back what you took away from us.
Well, it is an important part of a PUD that a certain percentage of those units that are built will be affordable. And Lowe has proposed that of the 1,600 units that are going to be built on site, they are willing to provide 50. 3%, 3% would be allocated to affordable housing. Now, our city does allow developers to pay a fee in lieu of providing housing units. But at the information session based on housing, our housing authority folks presented, and the cost of building these units far exceeds the fee that is being assessed to Lowe for not putting the units on site. We have seen them withhold that part of the plan. It did not go back before TRC. We were informed that it didn't have to be done at that point. And so the city has generated some power with them to pull back and reconfigure what the housing piece will look like. The port has proposed to give a parcel of land by Chapel Street, but they aren't willing to build the property, but it is land that they now own. I'm not sure who owned it before. Perhaps the city owned that one before too, I don't know. But it is important that everybody understand that the mix of us in Charleston is very different than most places, or at least it used to be. When I went to law school in Boston, I was stunned by the fact that people just are not in the same spaces like we were in Charleston. And so if we're to maintain the vibrancy and diversity that has made us Charleston, it's going to be a very different place. And so not allowing all of this fee in lieu of actual units would help us retain some of that diversity and get people back on the peninsula.
Yeah, and I would just say quickly that, I mean, it needs to be on that site because of, A, its size and scale. I mean, there's a huge opportunity to put some workforce housing, a wide spectrum, attainable housing, whatever buzzword you want to use, but where people are in close proximity to all the service jobs that we have on the peninsula, right? I mean, a lot of the peninsula is turned into a service economy through hospitality and restaurants and everything else. And a lot of those workers have to commute really, really far to get here, and that contributes to our traffic woes and quality of life issues for everybody. So on-site is absolutely critical.
Hi.
Okay.
Two things. You all must have really good email lists. It would be great if you could email some of those PowerPoint presentations to your whole email list and let people get more aware of what's going on. Secondly, we are supposedly the #1 tourist destination in the world. I would think the goal of this city is to preserve what makes the tourists come here. And I would think that you would want to get on board all the restaurants and the plantations and the shops and everything the tourists come here for, to be concerned that this is not going to represent what Charleston represents to the world right now.
The only thing I would add on that is, of course, I agree with you, but what we also need to remember is this is a place where people live and work and enjoy, and we need to keep it great for them as well.
I've got a two-part question. This has been extremely informative, so thank you. And stating the obvious, this is a set of decisions that are going to impact us for hundreds of years to come. It's very, very, very important. So two-part question. All I know about Lowe is that they are a hotel developer. Do they have experience developing master plan communities? That's part A. And the second question is, if they continue to play hardball to maximize value for the Port Authority, is there any legal recourse to get them off the job, cancel their contract, have a city referendum, and hire the right firm that understands our history and the importance of what we're about to do? So two-part question.
Well, Lowe does have experience with this. It's not regional, as far as I know, other than the Isle of Palms, which has been the feature.
Resorts.
Yeah, one of the, speaking of legal recourse, they're currently in litigation against the Isle of Palms for seeking to, the city was concerned about the traffic impacts, and they sought to change some understanding over the expansion of the site. And I've been using that example to remind people why zoning is so important, because when you confer legal rights on any entity, you can expect that they will use it against you if you try to take it away. And we're probably going to be talking about Union Pier in 10 years and 20 years. You're absolutely right. We're going to keep talking about it. And as far as the legal dimensions, I think in my experience with advocacy and administrative advocacy, Faith was actually my administrative law professor, is to point out, is to be aware that you can't challenge any government decision until the decision is actually made. But you can work as hard as you possibly can to set up the best possible record for why a decision might not be the best one for a municipality to make, financially or otherwise, or because it's not within the interest of its citizens, or whether it's inconsistent with its planning documents. And so that's really what, I think that's the state of the game that we're focused on right now, is make sure that we get as much information to the table about concerns about the plan, to have that change, because litigation is, of course, the last recourse. It's really, personally, and I say this as a former lawyer, it's not something you want to do. It's not going to make anybody happy here. So if we can avoid it, that's what we're trying to do. Anybody? You guys want to add to that?
Well, I'm the one non-lawyer up here, so I'm going to, well,
No way.
Vince, yeah, I mean, on the panel. So Faith, I don't know.
Well, I'll just say this, it's nice when the student outdoes the professor. It's great. And then in terms of the contract that Lowe has, that contract is with the State Ports Authority, and so they are the conveners, the purveyors, they created the contract, and the remedies for that contract are between the Port Authority and Lowe. And so I don't know that there's an avenue there, but it is our hope that we could negotiate the best site we can here. We don't know what's going to happen down the line with what happens when they start uncovering the pier. So I can't make any representations about that, but our interest here is to make this the best community center that we could.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions. Justin has one. Elise?
Hi. Climate change is the elephant in the room of these conversations, and I think we probably all saw the Scientific American article that came out this spring saying sea level rise is happening 3 times faster in the southeast. This site is remarkable that it is not only in the floodplain, but as you pointed out, Faith, much of it is on open water. nature has spoken, nature will continue to speak. And as the city is developing plans in other parts of the city to get people and buildings out of the floodplain, to ban fill and slab-on-fill forms of development, well, the level of hypocrisy is remarkable. My question is, and I loved your statement, Winslow, there is over $1 trillion of federal spending to leverage floodplain restoration and resilience. So not only should we be asking the city to go figure out how to use that to address the port's financial needs, but has anybody asked the developers to bond future risk? If they're so confident in this, they should put up their bond to pay for future mitigation to get anything out of harm's way and clean up their act, and to shift the terms of the debate, because this has got to be about a futuristic plan, not private gain in the near term.
Well, I will just reaffirm the points that you've made. We have to be concerned about building in this environment. If we know that we have flood risks, we're going to now put monster buildings right on the water's edge. Not only will it be at the water's edge, they have corners of these buildings over the critical line. They have asked the city to waive the buffers. If you had an estate out in the country and you had some wetlands, they'd tell you there's a buffer between the wetlands and where you can build. They're asking to build right up to, and in some instances, a little over the critical line. They tell us they're going to put in the first segment of the seawall, and they're going to put those buildings right on the seawall. As you have thought about the seawall in Charleston, did you ever envision that it would have a building on top of it? I mean, we have a seawall at the Battery. Those houses are not right up against the rail. And so, they tell us that this hill structure will enable them to attenuate the waves and then have a barrier of a seawall. But how do we know it's going to work? And you're exactly right. If we don't have a bonding or at least some engineering so we could figure this out before they get their zoning rights, they're going to be in Tahiti with drinks with cocktails in them and umbrellas, and we'll be stuck holding the bag. Not only the cost of covering the infrastructure, but we live through Hugo. There are a lot of other costs that happen. Your whole community changes. People test resilience in ways they never imagined. Can we all come back from something like that for whoever gets to live in this space? Questions to be considered.
Final question, so make it a good one.
Well, I think that the GIS renderings are very impactful to show the scale and mass of what is being proposed. And I think that it would be interesting to extend the GIS renderings onto the waterfront park, because that's a recent development, and it's more in scale, and it may not be as excellent as we would hope for Union Pier, but it would be interesting to see, investigate that development, what occurred there, how high are those buildings, and just sort of include that in the GIS renderings.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of power in GIS, and I mean, it's becoming the norm, and I think that this is we're just on the verge of being able to look with a different lens, size, scale, mass, and it's all coming down at that point. That image Winslow showed of kind of what is unacceptable, and now being able to literally, we could overlay that on that image and show that we're doing something that we just haven't done before, and that should cause some concern, should cause community conversation.
I'm sorry for those of you who still had questions. I hope you'll join us at the reception, which will be inside the museum, and you can speak with our wonderful panelists. I'd also like to tell you that this evening was recorded, and it will be on our YouTube channel, so please go back to it and share it with others. Finally, I think we can all agree that we had a great audience, great questions, and really wonderful comments from our moderator and our panelists. Can you join me in applause for this excellent group? Again, on behalf of this coalition, I want to thank you all for coming tonight and for helping us work for a better plan for Union Pier. Thank you.